So when I was a kid, I think maybe 5 years old, I started reading Harry Potter books, and I kept reading them until the last one came out, and they were a pretty big part of my childhood in general. And for about the past year, I would say I've had the urge to reread them, not because I expect them to be particularly good, but rather because I have a lot of nostalgia for them. Like, Harry Potter was a series of books that really spoke to me, as I was also like an outsider, I guess, when I was that young. I guess I still am, but yeah, it was something I really resonated with as a kid, and it was something I got teased for because when everyone else was like playing with toys and shit, I was reading Harry Potter because I was that fucking kid. And it was a big part of my life growing up, I guess, for various reasons. So now I have torrented the Harry Potter collection on EPUB, not just because I like piracy, because I like piracy, but also because I have never read the books in original English. I have the translated Estonian version somewhere in my house, but I'm not gonna look them up. But also because giving J.K. Rowling any fucking money at all would be a crime against humanity. However, I also prefer reading books on my tablet because it's way easier to read in bed, and my general preferred place to read books is the bed. So yeah, anyway, these books were really important to me. I spent a ton of time reading them. I remember sitting on the floor in this apartment and just reading a Harry Potter book, or laying in bed and reading a Harry Potter book. And the only other author that has this much of a nostalgic value for me is Terry Pratchett, although that is slightly compromised by having read a ton of Terry Pratchett when I was in the psychiatric hospital, which was, as all of you probably know, one of the most traumatizing events in my whole fucking life. And Terry Pratchett is also kind of complicated to read, and given that I've been kind of tired for a while, I thought reading Harry Potter is probably like a decent activity for now. So I want to give a prelude to what I like about Harry Potter as a book series, right? Because I've never been really into like the conventional fantasy of it. Well, I was as a kid, but like that's not the part that resonated with me the most. So that's not the part that I really remember, right? Like, of course, it was fun to download one of those one apps that lets you pretend to cast spells or uh, think about like, oh, what events did the characters go through, and oh, I wish I was at Hogwarts, but like none of that ever really spoke to me. The parts that always really spoke to me were all these tiny world building details, where all these moments where the characters just ended up going into some house or some town and just seeing how wizards live in their day to day lives, I guess. That was always the part that spoke to me the most. The fantasy foods were also really interesting to me because um, made up food items are always really fascinating to me. Like if they're unique and interesting. I also always really liked the ghosts. I remember because there were a bunch of ghosts, and I liked how they interacted with the characters a lot. And of course, since I'm autistic, I also liked all the lore on the wands and the brooms. Yeah, mostly wands and brooms. I like that lore too, but like I was never really that into it. So yeah, that's my intro to this video, I guess. So let's start reading Harry Potter. The first thing that stands out to me is that this is a horribly written book. You know how J.K. Rowling got rejected from like 20 publishers or whatever? Yeah, that was for a good reason. This is fucking garbage. like, it has a specific appeal. It's endearing in a way, and it's better than something that was completely soulless. But it's pretty much written on the level of like maybe a 13, 14-year old. However, the thing is, when you're a kid, that doesn't really matter to you, right? Like if someone's writing like a 14-year old, but like I'm 14 or I'm 6 or I'm 7 or I'm 8, right? And that's why it's really easy to enjoy Harry Potter books at that age. And I'm not saying that this book is written on for children, right? Because you can write children's books and write them well. No, this book is really, really poorly written in general, right? Um, it's not well edited, and the technique J.K. Rowling has been using, even on the first page, is primitive to say the best, or, or yeah, and it's not something that I would read as an adult. Ultimately, if I hadn't read it as a kid. Also, I think it's kind of fascinating how J.K. Rowling has spoken to a trans audience so elegantly when she was writing the book, because like so many trans people as kids like really related to the themes in Harry Potter. But then J.K. Rowling just ended up being like, oh, actually, women's rights are the thing that trans people hate, and it's not like they have actual problems. And the solution is to just say that trans people are bad. That's the solution. Whatever, whatever. Uh, it just kind of frustrates me that an offer that has been so important for so many trans children who were isolated, who were distant from society, right, and who only had books that related to those subject matters, those being Harry Potter, right, uh, betrayed, I guess, in that way in the future. You know what I mean. You know what I mean. Not to get all parasocial about it, but when I was a kid, I remember being like, "Oh, it's really cool that J.K. Rowling is a woman and has written really big books," because I thought that was something I didn't see too often, and I thought that was really fucking cool. And just having all of those inspiring elements so completely betrayed by deciding that you should restructure, or not restructure, but rather you should structure so much of your public persona around being the person who doesn't like trans people because trans people got mad at you because you didn't like trans people, right? It's fucking dumb. So I've read a bit more, and even though on a technical level it's still garbage, the character writing is actually relatively compelling because the characters described, which is currently Hagrid, McGonagall, and Dumbledore, right, are written actually incredibly well, right? It's like they're just comfortable people who you would want to be around, but all with very distinct personalities. Like again, it's hard to explain how vast the contrast is between the abysmal technical quality of the writing in parts and the imaginary version of this story that's playing out in my head, I guess. because it's not because anything that's basically you could take this exact sequence of events, rewrite them, and almost certainly improve them. Right? There's no part of this of what I have read right now that could not be improved with even a half decent person rewriting it from scratch. But the fact is that the ideas are there, the material is there, and I guess that's a big part of why it was such a good series of books that adapt to movies, because it has these concepts and characters that can appeal really well to the, I guess, just the children in general. And if you just rework them into a movie, you don't actually lose that much because the way it's written doesn't have that much of value. I'll tell again, I prefer books because I prefer reading over watching movies, and I prefer long form mediums which books can afford to be in ways that movies can't, and also more slice of lifey stories which are also way easier to tell in books. But yeah, anyway, it's just interesting to see like how compelling Dumbledore is from like the first time he's introduced to how reading this book would be painful if it was talking about a subject matter that was less fascinating and less nostalgic. Yeah. Another fascinating part that ties into what I was talking about before, I guess, is that the way that Harry is being treated is basically the same way that like all autistic kids get treated, where at least all of them. And from my knowledge, there are of course exceptions, but this seems to be a relatively common narrative where if you're autistic, right, you're kind of just seen as a nuisance to people for things you did beyond your control, and you always seem to be like someone whose presence is just a burden to everyone around them, right? And you know about autistic people and the trans population and so on and so on and so on and so on. And so on. But like it's just kind of interesting how deeply relatable all of this is. It's just an autistic child, and I'm just thinking back on like who I was and so on and so on when I actually like read this book when I was like a 5 year old. It's just interesting. It's just interesting. So I've made it a bit further into the book, and it's really easy to read. Like that's an upside. And I've kind of learned to ignore all the rough edges. Or maybe J.K. Rowling learned how to write as she wrote the book, so maybe there are just less of them. It's nowhere near as obnoxious as it was at the start. And I'm having a fun time. I'm having a good time. The world building is ham fisted as fuck, but I like reading exposition. Like, I'm personally of the opinion that exposition is generally good. Of course, depending on how it's delivered. But I think it's just a very effective way to communicate what people's perspectives on a fantasy world are, and I think it's one of the things that is like the easiest for me to not like mind, because I know that it's there for me, right? I know that it's there for explaining the world to me, and I like having the world explained to me. Anyway, with all that aside, I really like how Harry is actually written like an 11-year-old. Like, he's not completely portrayed as like incompetent. He has his own thoughts, but he has like really mature thoughts, and he has thoughts that are a natural outgrowth of having a horrible environment, right? But I mean, I also generally enjoyed the setup more than I did as a kid. Because as a kid, I was like, oh, these are just terrible things that are happening, right? Because I didn't really have that context for it. But now when I'm reading it, I can just be like, oh, this is very clearly an exaggeration, and it's just something that exists for an emotional reaction. And I mean, even though it is real in the world of the story, but it doesn't really. It doesn't really like it's obviously written from the perspective of Harry, right? Which um, which isn't a perspective of someone who's completely dejected, right? It's kind of hard to explain exactly, right? It's like a sort of hopeful pessimism, I guess, is the best way to describe it. And that that's was just interesting to read. And the medium of literature really allows you to like explore these more nuanced and complex perspectives, I guess. Even though the story itself is very simple, but you can read a lot from it, which is the great thing about literature. You can always just um, read into it. So yeah, the book has been actually enjoyable now, which is surprising. I didn't expect to be like kind of getting into it. I guess this is now just me live blogging, reading Harry Potter, because I'm getting kind of into it. I'm kind of getting like really into it. And I really like the distinctions where wizards know as little about the muggle world as the muggles know about wizards. Like, to me, that's always been a really, really cool detail. And just seeing it explored here is really comfortable for me because it's like someone else is alienated by how the world works as much as I am. Like again, like there's a very autistic read you can take of Harry Potter, and having a more critical set of eyes, like really, really lets me see why I connected with this as much as I did when I was a kid. Yeah, that's another interesting part. Also, another part I've always really liked about Harry Potter is the um, start of the year shopping list, because like this is really fantastical to me that there's just a neat list of things that you need instead of over here where it's just very chaotic and where you just kind of get books from the school library and those are the books you have for the year, and you have to do like a bunch of like seemingly arbitrary stuff that no one tells you to do but everyone kind of has to do. Again, another autism thing. But I'm sure this is less fantastical to people who went to like British private schools or whatever, because I'm assuming that that's where this entire system comes from. But from my perspective, this was always like really neat and really fascinating. Okay, so I started reading Harry Potter again, day two, and I was wrong about writing improving. I had just grown more used to it, which I guess is a fair rubric of like how tolerable something is. Like the, if you have the ability to get used to it, then it can't be that bad, I guess. But it's kind of painful coming back and starting to read it again because I'm really painfully aware of how poorly everything is written. Another interesting shift in perspective I have noticed is that when I was a kid, I saw Harry not being allowed to use his own money as like another injustice that happened to me, because in general even back then, I knew that controlling people financially was something that should be avoided and that had really obvious, really negative consequences. However, as an adult, I'm reading it and all I kind of see is an 11-year-old who just couldn't possibly use this money in a responsible way from the way that he describes his thought process, right? And now, not to be like the person who's like, oh, children should be subjugated to their parents or whatever, because to me that's an abhorrent ideology, and no need going in depth in this video. But I think this case is something that getting older actually can give you some perspective on. Because when I was a kid, I was like, oh, why couldn't you get a solid gold cauldron, right? And now as an adult, I'm just like, oh yeah, that's probably a really, really bad thing to spend your money on. It's just kind of funny. It's just kind of funny. It is actually surprising how much soul this book has sometimes. Like, there's a passage that describes how Ron has his robe on, right? And since he's from a poor family, it's not like the best fitting robe. And instead of just saying that the robe is short, J.K. Rowling said that you could see his sneakers from underneath his robe, which is really cool because then you're thinking about, oh, they're going into this wizard school, but like they still have sneakers on. I just thought that was cool. Another thing that's actually good is that Harry Potter as a character doesn't have any reference points outside his home life. So even though he's in this like really magical environment, he's still comparing it to um, the events that happened at home and the environment that he has grown up in. Now again, I'm not gonna say that this is like something that makes me feel particularly good because, of course, it's not really a sign of a um, of a character who has had a particularly good life, right? So I'm not gonna be like, oh yeah, this is the happiest thing I ever read or whatever the fuck. But like not to make this sentimental, but I think it's actually a really great writing technique to think about like, hey, what reference points would this character have, and how would they compare the current events to the things they can refer back to, especially when they're in a really foreign scenario. But honestly, this has been like the first piece of like actually inspired writing by J.K. Rowling. Like, there have been good character moments, of course, but when it comes to like the experience of actually like reading the book and like not just imagining the book to be something better than it is, this is the first thing I can actually say is like really well done. Another part of Harry Potter that I really like is how magic isn't something that just exists for humans. It's not like Hogwarts is built in a logical, deliberate way. Like I'm reading the description of the staircases right now, which was really memorable as a kid because it described staircases that didn't really make much logical sense, and that's always been like one of the cooler parts about the setting, I guess, where you just have these strange and inconvenient magical phenomena that you have to adjust to. I really like that part. One thing I do genuinely like is that Harry Potter is a very flawed protagonist in the books. Like, he's kinda annoying, he's someone who you really wouldn't like want to hang around necessarily, and he keeps like getting in trouble for like actually founded reasons because he has a short temper. He's kind of like a meddling person. He's quick to jump to conclusions and so on and so on and so on. So like all the main characters have really strong flaws, and ones that go beyond just being like, oh, this is a quirk or this is something that society doesn't like. It's like, oh, these characters would be kind of annoying to hang around in real life, much like every real person is kind of annoying in some situations, because no one can be like sociable and accommodating all the time or whatever you want to say. Anyway, I just wanted to point that out because I really like that element of the book. Also, another thing is that I don't know how far this extends, but the first Harry Potter book is more of a collection of short stories than an actual like novel. Like if you actually read the book, you have like very distinct chapters that have completely self-contained storylines. Like of course they refer back to other chapters, but like in a way that like a series of short stories would. Like it each chapter has a beginning, a middle, and end, and they have their own gimmicks and settings and theming and so on and so on and so on. And so on. So I think that's a interesting thing to observe because it's not really it it doesn't gain that much from being presented as a novel. It's very obviously a kind of amateurish take on a children's book, I guess. Although there's nothing wrong with having a collection of like short stories, even if they're in the form of a novel. It's just very clear that this is what the book is, and it's just interesting to like see the format laid out as it is, I guess. So here's another Harry Potter observation. The structure of the books in general revolves a lot around like seasons, I guess, and that's a part I've always really liked. Is that for any book you can see like specific events repeat, like Christmas break and other events like that, because they've just always been like really intriguing to me, and I've always really liked seeing how the setting changes depending on the season. Because even though Rowling isn't really good at describing Hogwarts, uh, you kind of like think up an image for yourself, and when it's described as basically the opposite of what you would expect it to be, it's like wow, that's kind of interesting because the changes throughout the seasons are really drastic, right? Like the water freezes over in the winter, the school becomes empty, and general it's characterized mostly by the water and the busyness of it also. That's a cool detail. I mean, I guess that's really the trend with this book is that all the details are really cool, but like the writing style, the um, the general structure of it, I guess, the storytelling, world building, and etc. 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 It's generally kind of not that great. So it's like all the cool stuff is in the details, and it makes it really hard to actually like figure out what I think about it because I really like details, right? And the part that I really like is the best part, and that makes it kind of hard to like actually evaluate it or figure out what I think about it because aside from the nostalgia, I'm also really biased because I really like granular storytelling, and that's what Rowling does the best. I've gotten to the part of the book where Dumbledore says that he sees socks in the mirror that shows people what they want the most. But I think the reading that most people have on this scene is influenced by the fact that the socks line is so much more memorable and quoted than the following lines, because it's actually a relatively simple scene to understand. Like if you just have like any type of critical thinking, I mean, of course, most people read Harry Potter as a child, so they wouldn't have that type of thinking. But as an adult, this is a painfully obvious scene. Like there's no real mystery to it. There's no real ambiguity to it. So I'm just gonna read the scene out. Professor Dumbledore, can I ask you something? Obviously, you've just done so, Dumbledore smiled. You may ask me one more thing, however. What do you see when you look in the mirror? I I see myself holding a pair of thick woolen socks. Harry stared. One can never have enough socks, said Dumbledore. Another Christmas has come and gone, and I didn't get a single pair. People will insist on giving me books, right? So it's like, oh, why did Dumbledore see socks in the mirror? Well, it's because people, um, the way that people see Dumbledore goes very contrary to how he has been characterized, right? Because throughout the entire book, you've been basically like every time Dumbledore is mentioned, he always does something to either cheer himself up or cheer the people around him up, right? He's a person who cares deeply, and he's a person um, who wants to live life in a way that is enjoyable, right? Like that's like an essential part of Dumbledore's character. However, when you see the way that other people interact with Dumbledore, like for example in the start, where you had like the fucking um, collectible cards, and it was like, oh, Dumbledore is one of the greatest wizards to ever lived, and so on and so on and so on and so on. Like people just keep saying that. It becomes very obvious that the way that Dumbledore is perceived by the people around him um, uh, goes very contrary to the things that he actually like wants and desires, right? Like um, his entire uh, the way that he is perceived, right, is just as a wizard, right? He's not really perceived as a person, and he wants the socks, right? Because he wants his desires as a person, which are as simple as they would be for anyone, right? He doesn't have any grand magical ambitions. He's just a normal person who has normal desires, and he just wants fucking socks, right? But since that's not respected by the world around him, when because he's just so fucking overshadowed by his reputation as the strongest wizard of all time, and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. Right? That makes sense. That makes sense. I can't fucking explain it because I'm bad at explaining concepts off the cuff. Like that's why I like writing, because it gives me time to like figure out how to say things. That's my quick fucking analysis of the sock scene in Harry Potter. Holy fucking shit! This was fucking. Okay, so I looked it up because I was like, oh, someone's probably fucking answered this question. Like, in some like fucking extra canon. Like, I don't care about anything outside the text because I like interpreting things the way I want to interpret things, and I don't really care about like the author's intent at all generally, and I don't really care about like things outside the text that I care about. Like this is a take I have on everything. Like I have absolutely zero interest in finding out the true canon of anything. I just want to have a picture that I can interpret with all the information that I care about in it. But turns out in the true canon, the reason Dumbledore saw socks or um, said that he saw socks is because he really just, like, his greatest desire is to also have his family because he's an orphan like Harry, so he also wants to, like, just have people who care about him. Anyway, my reading was pretty much right, like, when it comes to the character moment. But it's just, it's more fleshed out, I guess, and yeah, doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter at all. I just got interested, so I had to look it up. So, I finished Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and I'm still very split on it. It's very endearing, the characters are very charming, it's very nostalgic, and I remember basically every single thing that happens in the book because that's how into it I was as a kid. And it definitely had upsides. It had some cool concepts, even though they're way more blasé now than they were when I was a kid because I just have been exposed to concepts that are way cooler now. It has some concepts that are kinda cool, even though it's not. It. I generally don't like when people aren't able to remove things from their contexts, right? I not in that way, but I mean like things from their cultural impact. Because it's really easy to be like, oh, I don't like the cultural impact of a thing, so I don't like the thing because of the cultural impact it has had, right? However, with Harry Potter, when it comes to a lot of the concepts it has, um, it's kind of really hard to divorce them from how people interact with them, right? Like the house system is kind of cool, but it's really just like a competition between fucking wizard Nazis and the protagonists, right? And like all the fantasy foods are cool, right? But like they've been so overdone in real life that they're not really fantasy anymore. Like you can get fucking every flavor jelly beans and stuff like in real life, and it's like if that exists in reality, like is that really that fantastical anymore? You know, I guess the commercialization and the um, rampant wish fulfillment of Harry Potter fans has kind of stripped it of all of its magic. Also, I'm really tired right now. I can't sleep. I yeah. And like the writing is bad. The structure of the book is really fucking clumsy, and it would have worked better as like a series of short stories. But it can't be a series of short stories because it has to be a novel for some reason. So that was something that I didn't particularly like. It just seemed like it was like halfway between those two things, right? Where every chapter had a really clear story and through line it was telling, but still had to fit into the context of the novel, which just made the individual stories worse and which made the novel worse. And uh, I because short stories can have a through line, right? Like they don't have to be completely isolated. It's just they have to have like satisfying beginnings and middles and endings, which the book tried to do, but it just got kind of bogged down in everything, so it didn't really work as well as it could have. And it was also kind of too short, which is a weird thing to say because it wasn't the most pleasant thing on the planet. And I know that the future books are gonna be way longer than the first one, but it's like it kind of was a disservice to the setting how short the book was. But I know it's gonna have like six fucking sequels, so that's not something I can really criticize it about. It was just like not satisfying because it was like the scope of the story was so obviously beyond this book, right? Like the scope of the story was obviously like meant to be a long form story, and the book is just kind of short for no reason because it's kind of like sequel baity, I guess. Not in the way like, oh, this is like a part of a larger narrative. It's like, oh, this is just like a trailer of what the actual book is supposed to be. So structurally, stylistically, technically, and on all of those fucking pretentious fucking levels, it was a bad book. On the level of a really endearing piece of fiction, it was a nice read. I don't know what the fuck to think about it. I don't know what the fuck to think about any of it.